All right, so let's talk about how we would get input from our users. So of course, user input can come from many sources. It really depends on your program, what kind of sources you have for your users to give you information. So you might have something like buttons, right? So a click on a button is basically a form of user input. Or you might have fields where the user can type something and you would get information from there. For our particular programs at this stage in our course where we don't have graphical user interfaces and things like that, we only have our command line. So one way to get user input is from the command line. And the way the user gives us input on the command line is by typing a text. Okay, so we might print out something to ask the user for some information, and then we can read that information that the user has given us. Now, the way we read the information from the user is with this command, read line. Okay, the L is capitalized. Read line will simply get the line that the user has inputted and will assign it to some variable in our program. Okay, so here I have the example user input equals read line. Okay, so let's try that out. I have here a new project. You can reuse your old project or create a new one with a run configuration. You know the drill by now. You know how to create this, so that should be fine. Now, let's write out some message for our user. So we would simply say something like print line input something. Okay, we don't really at this stage, we don't really care what the user inputs as long as we can read it. We have a value or variable user input equals read line. Okay, and we have print line, something like you wrote $user input. Okay, so that will just print out whatever the user entered here. So let me run this code and we will see in our console how we can achieve this. So basically we have our console here, we have our input something. Now if I click here, okay, at the end, I have a kind of prompt that is waiting for me to type something. Okay, so I'm just going to type something random, pineapples. Okay, and the message says, the program says you wrote pineapples. Okay, so whatever I inputted here, you can see it's in green. Okay, whatever I put here, the system will say you wrote this. Okay, so read line has basically read the whole line and then use that to kind of give me the output here. And of course, I can run this again and it will, if I enter like multiple words here, like something like this is a whole sentence, okay, and I would get this message. So the input for the user is delimited through a return or an enter. Okay, so you can only type one line because this will only read one line. All right, so let's talk about how we would go about inputting a number. Now, everything we input and read with that read line command is read as a string because we are typing something in the console and the system interprets that as a string. But luckily, strings can be converted into numbers or what we call integers. Okay, so in a software development language, a number is sometimes referred to as integers. There are other types of numbers, but integers are simply numbers that we use every day. So 1, 2, 3, 25, 3,500,000, right? Those are numbers. Now, before I introduce how we can convert a string into a number, I have to introduce another concept, another idea that we will again use and explain more extensively later on in our course, but I simply need it here as a requirement of the language. So what I want to introduce is the idea of a null, which is basically the idea that the command line can return nothing. Okay, so nothing is called null in Kotlin. So to guard against this, we have this parameter question mark colon, and then we provide a value. And the way this works is we have an example here. I have my user input, I read line. If read line returns null, if it returns null, then use this value. Okay, so that simply means that this value will never be null. Okay, because if the first part of my equation is null, then I use an empty string. Okay, so this is kind of a guard against empty returns, empty information. Now, I won't go into too much detail. I just wanted to explain it briefly because it's just a requirement of the language and a very important aspect of Kotlin, by the way. But we won't necessarily be using it too much because we will always introduce some information. And in addition, we will explain this in a lot more detail in a later section where we will discuss null values and what this parameter means in greater detail. But for now, don't worry too much about this. It's not actually being used. It's just kind of a precaution and a requirement of the language. So we need it there in the code, in the line code, but we don't actually use it. So just keep in mind what it is, but we will discuss it later on in our course. So this is how we transform a string into a number. So we read the string with the readline command, and then we have this function toInt. Okay, so that would be how we read it. So let's try this out in our IDE. So I have here val user input is going to be readline question mark colon empty value. Okay, so this simply means that user input will always have a value, and then I can simply print line the message you wrote, whatever you want to put here, colon dollar user input. Okay, so let's run this. Oh, sorry, user input dot to int. Okay, so this requires the curly braces. Okay, so we have added those. So the system added that for me here easily. So I have dollar curly brace user input dot to int close curly brace. So let's run this and see what we get. All right, so here we are. I didn't print out a message. We can actually print out something like print line input a number. Okay, so let's run that again, just to kind of give some information here. Okay, input a number, I'm gonna say 5, and then I get the message you wrote 5. Now, importantly, this is an integer now, so it's a number. So what I can do with it, I can, for instance, multiply it, and I can do times 2. Okay, and if I run that again, I will get, so input a number 5, and then you wrote 10. Now, obviously, this is wrong. I didn't write 10, but you get the idea. I can use this value to write times 2. So I can put something like double is and multiply that by 2. All right, so I get 7, double is 14. Okay, so simple math equation here, multiplication. I readline that information that I put here, and I have this dot toInt to transform that input into a string. Now, importantly here, you must introduce a number because we are not doing any error checking. So if we don't introduce a number here, this will cause an exception. And there are ways to handle those exceptions, handle those cases where the user inputs wrong information. We will cover those in great detail later on in the course in other sections, but for now we won't focus on that. Since it is kind of us practicing these commands, we will always be introducing correct values until that time where we will learn to handle the wrong input as well. So for instance, let me just show you how this works. If I do here test instead of a number, so I will get an exception. Okay, so it's just an exception that says number format exception because I'm trying to convert a test string to an integer, to a number, and that of course doesn't work. So make sure you always input the correct number here, right? So I introduce whatever number that is, and I get the correct transformation here. And like I said, error handling it will be discussed later on in the course. So we will focus a lot on how we can guard against these errors, how we can manage them, and how we can retry everything when the user doesn't input a correct value. But for now, we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to input the correct value, so a number every time we use that. All right, guys, so I've decided to include another lecture here in this section about how to generate a random number, because this concept will be quite useful throughout our course, and it will allow us to add some random functionality to our projects and to our programs. So generating a random number is very, very simple. So first of all, we have a what we call a class or an object. Now, you don't need to know what this means yet. We haven't reached that section of our course. We will discuss it in due course. But for now, let's go ahead and start typing random. And here you will find a few different random suggestions. Okay, the one that we're looking for is the one that is in Kotlin.random. Okay, this is the package in which this functionality is available. Now, again, packages is something we will discuss in a future section, so don't worry too much about that. Just for now, we need to click on that Kotlin.random and hit return or enter. And we will see here at the top that we have an import, some text that is, like I said, not important at the moment. This is the package where this functionality resides, and the keyword import simply says that we will use, or we want to use in this program, we want to use the functionality in that package. But don't worry about this. This is just something we need to add, and the IDE just adds that automatically for us. So we don't need to worry about that for now until we reach the section where we will discuss this in greater detail. So we have our random keyword here, and if we say random dot next int, okay, so next int will simply give us the next integer available on a random basis, right? So if we have that, and if I just print line whatever that gives us, okay, and I run the code, if the code runs, that will simply give us a random integer. So this can be arbitrarily large. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really have any constraints, okay? Now, there are situations where we want to put some constraints on the random integers that are generated. So we have a few methods for that. Print line random dot next int, and we see here that we have another method called next int where we can pass a value until which we will generate the integer. So if I put here 10 and I run this code, we will see that this line generates an integer from 0 until 9. So 10 is not included. Okay, so the limit here is not included, and it starts from 0. So we can get 0, 1, 2, up until 9, and that's it. Okay, so whatever the limit you put here, it will generate up to that limit, not including it. One other option that we have is print line random dot next int from until. So let's say we want numbers from 20 until 30. And again, 20 is included, 30 is not included. So it will be randomly generating 20, but it will never return a 30 for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. There we go. So we have a 21, which is between the two values that we have provided. Now, of course, we can generate other random numbers as well. So we can say random dot next double. Okay, so we want a double 300.0. So that is a double. Okay, so that will generate a double for us. Okay, there we go, 169.60 and so on. So I invite you to play around with these methods. Again, next double will have until, and we'll have a from until. Okay, so you can practice and try out all these different functionality. I think the most useful that we will have are either this one, next int until a certain value, or next int from until. So we will use these mostly, but it's always useful to know that there are other methods available as well if you need them in your code.